looks forward to this. So the broadcast is now live. So today we are going to be talking about getting real with reconciliation. And so I have on my panel three amazing people who are completely involved with this process. The first one I'm going to introduce is Shalini Sinha. Shalini, would you please give your brief introduction?
Sure, Mary, thank you. So I have the honor and the pleasure of currently serving as the City of Edmonton's chairperson for the Citizens Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. And that is a volunteer role. We're new. We were inaugurated in 2020, and I'm really pleased to do that. And I also have been a longtime activist and anti-racism consultant, so I also provide anti-racism and anti-oppression support to leaders who are looking to create some transformational change.
Thank you, Shalini.
Thank you.
Next, we have our counselor, Aaron, and it's so wonderful to have a counselor on City Council who is of Aboriginal descent, and I am so proud of that. So I just gave a brief introduction, but please go ahead and talk about your background in reconciliation.
Oh, well, thank you. So Aaron Paquette, and I'm currently serving as City Councilor in Edmonton for Ward Dene, and running for re-election in these very interesting times. But my background is that my mother's family comes from Norway, and my father's family is Cree and Métis, and we have a long history in my family of residential school and of kids being taken from their home. And my wife is Cree from Saddle Lake, and so with our children, our work is to break those cycles of trauma and to instill in them a sense of pride and possibility, and to help them to understand and to share with others as they grow that while no one alive today is responsible for the things that happened in the past, we are responsible for the future that we choose to create together. And
Wow.
That's where our focus can and should be moving forward.
Thank you so much for that perspective. We have a young person, Davina Mcleod, who I met today at the Orange Shirt Day run at Kinsman Park, and that's where I decided to pull her into the show. So I'm so grateful to her for accepting this at really short notice. So Davina, let's hear a small introduction from you. I think she's stuck. So Davina is actually studying at SAIT. She is doing an Indigenous program. And hello, Davina, can you hear me? Davina, hello?
Yeah, my name is Davina Mcleod.
And if your internet is stuck, if you just turn off your video, we might hear you.
Oh.
Could you hear me? Hello?
We had her so well earlier.
Having some trouble.
Yeah. Today is a very difficult day to speak about this because this is the day when we want to remember all the children who were recently discovered in the excavations that happened. So it's a very difficult day for all of us, and to understand that in our common humanity, we have failed miserably. So, Davina, since you're back, I just wanted to allow you to speak your introduction.
Yeah, my name is Davina Mcleod. I am from Aklavik, Northwest Territories. I am currently going to school at SAIT taking business administration, and I am Indigenous in both. I'm Inuvialuit and Gutchin.
Thank you so much. Let me just put this question to Shalini. about, how can we as just, common citizens of Edmonton support this cause other than just, wearing an orange shirt to show our solidarity. What else can we do?
Hmm. That's such a great question, Mary. Thank you. And it's one that is most on my mind. When I listen and hear what Indigenous elders and knowledge carriers have to say, one of the things that they remind us of all the time is that reconciliation is the job of non-Indigenous people. And to me, that's really important. I take that very seriously. When we're standing against any oppression, there's quite a lot of work to do, and there's a few steps that can start. I think the first steps are to start to acknowledge what are the stereotypes and where did they come into our lives. And so we've all been saturated and surrounded and raised with all these stereotypes, and it's always not true. It's always misinformation, but we can acknowledge and be honest about what we've heard and what's not true, and start with that. And then to start to move to consciously undo this misinformation that we have been trained to learn. And that's when we need to do the work of actually reading and listening and learning and doing and checking out history, reading books. There's a beautiful book. I might have it here. I was talking about today called Border by Thomas King. That's just come out as a graphic novel. There's a lot of accessible information out there, but we do need to do our work and find out what the history is, and to do our own emotional journey of healing so that we can be there and listen. I think that's the first thing that we need to do. And I think it's also extremely important for us to own this, no matter what. So when I think of myself, my parents were immigrants, and we come from a part of India that was deeply oppressed under British rule, absolutely crushed. My father experienced tremendous poverty. And my parents, while my mother never wanted to leave India, my parents found that they left and they came far away, and their life was that of difficulty and struggle and hardship. And as much as someone in my position as an immigrant or a child of immigrants might want to say, this isn't about me, I didn't do this here, I have my own struggle, it is so important for us and for me to look at, well, where do my people come from, and what happened there, and what is the land there, and actually where am I living, and who invited me? Because I'm very conscious that no First Nation invited me here. And when my parents applied to stay, they didn't apply to any First Nation to stay. And so they applied to a colonial government and they got permission to stay. But was that the right place to get that permission from? And so we can have our head down and have our eyes closed and be complacent in this, but I don't think that's good enough. I think we need to connect and learn and keep our eyes open and find out what is our role in these relationships to stand against oppression that maybe our people experienced oppression as well. And are we going to stand by here blind and allow the oppression of other people to continue in their own homeland, So those are, for me, the key places to start and what matters to me the most.
Wow, that was so deep. I agree. I mean, there is just no way of getting to the place and really understanding the pain of Indigenous communities, but at least we can share and support them in what they're going through and be present. Our presence is so important. I'm going to ask Davina, because I know that her mom and her grandmom have experienced residential school. So what kind of conversations and stories she has heard from her family, and how does she want to, bring that into perspective for today?
I've spoken a lot with my grandmother about her time at residential school because she is 64 now. So she was kind of there when the height of the worst was happening. And the first story she told me was only actually this year when everything came about. Because before it was obviously a difficult subject that no one really wanted. So no,
It's really hard to hear her. I think we've lost Davina. So let me move on to Aaron. You have a beautiful history in art, in like helping, using art to help heal. So I just want you to talk a little bit about your journey through art. You're muted, by the way.
Anything in particular you'd like to know?
I just love your painting. So can you speak to us about how they, like how you plan them, how you conceptualize
Sure.
them, and what is the meaning of some of those things to us common people?
Well, most of my work is based in cultural stories and cultural learnings and understandings, and it's a it's a language. It's a language that helps us to convey truths without words, and just like music or sound allows us to understand something on another level. Because when we use our words, what happens is that we've actually got our filters, and our filters sort of tend to um, uh, pick and choose what we want to accept as our understanding. Whereas music and art allows us to sort of bypass some of those filters so that we can talk a little bit more directly with each other on a more fundamental level. And so that's the idea. And in my indigenous culture of Cree background, there wasn't really a concept of art the way that it is in Western society, where it's something that you use to that you put on a wall or hang up, that sort of thing. It's a normal expression of how you would go about your daily life. So if you were making clothing, for example, you would automatically adorn it. If you were, creating a teepee, you would automatically have something that beautifies it, just like you would with everything else that you do in your life, so that life itself becomes the art. And
That
while
is
some
so
people may think,
beautiful.
oh,
I just love that perspective, because I think it's true for all indigenous cultures around the world. So I just wanted to interject. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
yeah. And I was just going to make the point quickly that a lot of, like, in the Western culture, that sounds to many people like it's just like impractical, or like, just, okay, hippie, you go on with your life. But the fact is that it's an essential part of our life. As soon as our needs are met in any civilization, as soon as the basic needs are met, the very next thing is that there's an explosion of culture, an explosion of meaning. And so it's a fundamental part of who we are. And if we ignore that part, or if we make that part of who we are as human beings, if we relegate it to something that is not important or non-serious, we do ourselves a lot of damage, because
Yeah,
we lose out on a whole language.
that's beautiful. Would you say that your political career has kind of created a wedge between you and your artistic explorations?
Not in any way. In fact, I've brought the exact same approach that I have to my writing or my painting or music. I've brought the exact same mindset to my career in politics. So when I look at issues, I always try to find the hidden language. When I look at policy, I try to find the hidden ways that we are communicating. And when you do that, you kind of start seeing what maybe other people have missed. And that's been really powerful in my career so far, because I'm really blessed to have made huge strides forward in making lives better for a lot of people simply through that approach. So I really find that uh, I'm still an artist, even as as a politician. The art has a different form, but the underlying motivations and inspirations are the same.
I'm going to put one more question to you, because right now I don't have Davina. So, like in your political career, how do you see that the work you do has helped reconciliation for Aboriginal communities with every other community that resides in Edmonton?
Well, okay, so it's a really important question. I have to answer it this way. Um, Words have power. They have more power than we give credence to. Words have caused world wars where millions of people have lost their lives. Words have also caused lasting peace where millions of people have found their potential. Words can crush a soul, but they can also teach someone how to fly. And most of us don't use our words on purpose. We just exist. But if we use our words intentionally, that's where we start to see change. So in the words of laws, like the Indian Act, for example, those words created a reality for Indigenous people that enforced poverty, enforced pain, enforced trauma, enforced separation. And those things became generational. And it is only, I am the first in my family in over 100 years who was not stolen from my home. And so the reversal of those words is so important. And so when it comes to government and politics and community, words create a narrative and they create a story. And all we are is story. Anyone who's listening, anyone who's observing this, their story, their narrative of who they are determines their everyday life. The story of a nation determines how someone feels as part of their community. And that's why this is such a difficult conversation, because people don't like to hear their story challenged of a just and fair and equitable Canada. They don't like to hear that maybe there has been atrocity, not just on Indigenous people, but on immigrants and on Black people and on, traditionally people who are LGBTQ2S+. There has been a lot of atrocity and trauma visited on those folks that is not in keeping with the narrative that we have of Canada. And the question we have now going forward is, are we strong enough and capable enough to incorporate more of these stories so that our story becomes more true and our path to the future becomes more clear? I think we are.
Yeah, and actually addressing it just like you did, absolutely open and just putting it out there raw is very difficult. It's not easy to be a politician and to be able to state that. Thank you so much for your honesty and genuineness. Shalini, in the work you do, how do you see, like what are the kind of things you have worked with Aboriginal communities and how do you see it moving forward?
So, and some people tell from my accent, so my identity is located on 3 different continents. And while I grew up here in Alberta, I went away, I became an immigrant and I went to Ireland for 22 years and then came back to Edmonton just in the last couple of years. And so for me, actually, before I left Alberta, I was conscious of the oppression against Indigenous people because of some things in my personal life. And I think because of the experience I was experiencing, and my parents really did come from a background of social justice. And so we were paying attention in a different way. When I went to Ireland, I learned to notice that there was an Indigenous nomadic ethnic community in Ireland called the Travellers. And the oppression against Travellers in Ireland is incredibly harsh. And it's a tricky thing because Ireland itself was a colonized country. It experienced incredible brutality for 9 centuries. And famine, genocide, ethnocide, incredible. And yet within Ireland, within its own communities, then the nomadic community, the Travellers, continue to be deeply oppressed. And one of the things I noticed was the connection of the type of oppression that is faced by Indigenous, traditionally nomadic communities. And it's specific. And in that way, I kept drawing on what I had learned in Alberta when I left and kept paying attention to what was happening here while I was in Ireland. So there's a couple of things that are different. So first of all, nomadic groups are not random. It's not random wandering. It is clear cultural relationship with land in a different way and moving around seasonally. And if you wish to overcome, overpower, and control a group of humans, if culturally they move, it's very hard to control them. And if they don't have a sense of ownership, but have a sense of relationship, it's very hard to impose your demands of ownership on them. And so the oppression is harsh and different. It's different. And so I noticed that, and I worked on elevating issues against travelers in Ireland. In fact, I made a decision at some point that in the spectrum of racism, and I'm not at all interested in comparing one experience to another, but in my mind, there's some key linchpin issues. And if we all stood against those issues and created uplift in that place, it would get easier for everyone who experiences racism. And to me, in my mind, the number one key thing is racism against Indigenous people, wherever it is in the world. And in Alberta and in Canada, we need to look at this very specifically. And then the other piece is racism against Black people, and what happened there in terms of slavery and how we've all been pitted against each other colonially. And so just coming back to your original question, Mary, I will say that taught me a lot, and I was watching. And so I was watching, before I moved back, I was watching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how Canada was responding. What I would say the number one thing currently, the wider society who's not engaged in these issues, they're struggling to understand the depth to which these behaviors and hurts are woven into the fabric of Canada. They're absolutely woven in. And so they've affected all of us, whether you notice it at all or not. And what I would say again is that there is so much work and heavy lifting that we can do without demanding that of Indigenous people. The discovery of the unmarked graves at residential school was well known. What just happened was it was evidenced. But the knowledge that children went missing at school, that children did not return, the knowledge that children were being kidnapped and taken was everywhere to be heard and seen in Canada. And yet people have been trained not to hear or listen, not to see it or listen. And so I would say the first thing to do is to evolve yourself as a person, to be that person who can hear and see when everything about the society has trained you to go blind and deaf. It's all there. And when you realize it's there, and then you need to do the work on what it means to hear it. But when you realize that, then what we start to do is connect on our common humanness. And that's a very easy connection to make. When we realize that these blinders come off and we start to see ourselves as humans together, it's a very real and easy connection to make. And then we can stand by each other without doing inappropriate things of demanding so much of people who have not, who, you know, my people, my family have been led by other people from the moment my parents left India. So my parents were born into colonization and then left India and have lived in other people's government systems. I was born into someone else's government system. I emigrated, lived in someone else's government system. My people and I, my children, we have always lived in someone else's system, and we've tried to survive it. And if you ask me which system would I prefer to live in, from the teachings and what I learn about the structures and the wisdom of First Nations people, I as an outsider would much prefer to live in that system than I would in the colonial inheritance that we have, because the colonial inheritance was based on overpowering to exploit resources and people, to remove wealth to a small group of people. And it's bad for all of us. It's bad for all of us. It's very disconnecting. It's very hurting. We have a homelessness problem. We have a drug addiction problem. We have ultra rich who are not any happier as humans. We have a great exploitation and destruction of our environment. And it has hurt everybody. And I would actually like everyone, especially non-Indigenous people, to stand up and stop agreeing to the forces of colonization and domination. And I think the best thing we can do is to stop it, stop following it, sit down, listen, and start following Indigenous people. I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit, and I do want to say one more thing. It has been, so one of the early things I learned decades ago about First Nations cultures was this concept of looking 7 generations ahead and 7 generations back, and whatever decisions you're making should hold true for 7 generations ahead. Now I'm standing here at this point, and we need to understand that the original atrocities were 7 generations ago. We're talking about 7 generations of cruelty and suffering. And I had the chance to listen to retired Senator Murray Sinclair on the radio today, and he said that every generation's responsibility is to decide what we're going to do now to help repair this positively, understanding it's going to take 7 generations to repair this.
Wow.
That longevity of sight is incredible to me. So are you asking me, would I prefer, as somebody who has always lived in someone else's world, who I'd like to be led with? I'd like to be led by the people who have a relationship with the land, continue to come to us with friendship, even after 7 generations of torture, continue to come to us with friendship, and can lead us in that way. It's our job to be quiet and be led.
Thank you, Shalini. That was deep. D Maiden wanted to know how do we get involved with the community, with the indigenous people, and support them directly. So my question to Aaron would be, being somebody who helps write policies and makes so many big decisions for everybody. Um, I seriously feel that the best thing to do would be something really practical, which, where like young indigenous children have a program for mentoring them, or somebody's taking them on and really supporting them to reach their goals, or, things that are absolutely on the ground practical, where you can see that community move forward because of those things you put in place. I don't see those things happening. People are just talking and talking, and there is all these orange shirts. And yeah, we really want to show the solidarity. I understand, but it has to go deeper than that. And to me, it's like time is just going, and people are not doing things that can actually make this uh, real for the people of the Aboriginal communities that we reside with. They are our neighbors. We belong with them in the common humanity. So I just want to be able to see that change, and I want to be part of that change. So how can we make that happen, Aaron?
Well, it's a big question. And the answer is the will of the people. If you want to see change, you have to demand it. What I would share with viewers is that when we get frustrated at government for inaction, it's largely because they are listening to voices who demand no action. They don't want it to happen. It happens with Indigenous relations. It happens with climate. It happens with issues of equity and homelessness and all sorts of things. So if we want politicians to act differently, we have to elect politicians who will act differently. And so that is, a lot of people say, I don't want to get involved in politics. But the problem is, if you don't pay attention to politics, that doesn't mean politics isn't paying attention to you. And so you need to choose your dance partner. So if you want good policy, you have to have good politicians. Otherwise, they will just listen to the angriest voices, the lowest common denominator as far as advancing issues. And because they think that's where their votes are going to come from. They think that that's the voice that they're representing. If you want change, you need to change who's in power. And part of that has to do with the people, but there is responsibility on politicians as well to show leadership. For example, when politicians say that something is not important, people tend to believe that. So when we had provincial politicians calling COVID the flu, people started to treat it like the flu. But if you have politicians who say climate change is real, weather effects are happening, it's costing us money, we have to start doing something about it, people start believing that because the evidence is there, and their leaders, who they implicitly trust, whether they say they don't trust politicians or not, are giving them those words to believe in. So it takes leadership on both levels, both from the public and from our political leaders. Now, that's the way to ensure change. For people who want to get involved locally, try to find organizations like Bent Arrow, for example, and tell them, listen, I don't know a lot, but I want to be involved. Point me in the right direction. And they will. They'll be very happy to point you in the right direction and start utilizing your energy. Build relationships with Indigenous people. It's really that simple. I want to tell you a little bit about what the Indian Act did, because we talk about wanting to do something, but if we don't know what it is we're trying to change, it's really hard to get on the right path. So very quickly, and I won't tell you everything, but I'll tell you some of what the Indian Act did. It denied women's status as human beings.
Wow.
And for example, my grandmother didn't vote until she didn't have the right to vote until the late 60s. And they had to fight for that. They introduced residential schools with the Indian Act. They created reserves. That's how reserves were created, through the Indian Act. And if a municipality, a city, didn't want a reserve close to them, everyone would have to move. The reserve would move. So that created economic isolation. They took away Indigenous names and in place gave them European names. And they didn't allow First Nations people to leave the reserve. You had to go to an Indian agent who would ask you why you were leaving and get a pass. And sometimes you'd get your pass, sometimes you wouldn't. And this kept people from taking their produce to market, because at first Indigenous people were farming. But because of this enforced policy, well, it wasn't a policy, it was just an action. Because of this, the pass system, their goods couldn't go to market. They rotted in warehouses. And so after numerous years of that, you don't have money to farm anymore. Now you're stuck on government rations. They also denied First Nations from forming political organizations, from hiring lawyers, from speaking in their native language, or even wearing traditional clothing, and made all their ceremonies illegal. People don't, and I haven't even touched on the medical experimentation, the sterilization, the starvation, and on and on. People don't know this history of Canada. My mom was sterilized.
Wow.
The doctor
My
said, "No more
goodness.
brown babies for you," when she asked what had happened. This is real life, and this is the impacts of the Indian Act. So when you see someone on a street corner and their solace is alcohol or drugs, and they can't trust the institutions enough to put their lives in their hands, so to speak, if they can't trust police, if they can't trust hospitals, if they can't trust government, there's a reason for that. It's because those institutions harmed them and their family for generations. And trauma is a poison. Just like any poison in our environment, it doesn't go away. The more, for example, there was, I think it was DDT, used to be sprayed in the 70s. And that poison actually compounded up the food chain, so to speak, until it was put everyone at risk. And that's why they stopped it. But trauma is the same. Every generation gets this distilled trauma and adds their own. And so you see folks on the streets and you think, what a lazy bum, get a job. That's someone who has been destroyed by our systems through colonization and the Indian Act. Our society is built on those broken lives. I mean, there's a positive too. Newcomers to Canada work very hard. They've taken an opportunity. They've made wonderful things, and we should tell those stories too. But we should also tell the story about how all of that was made possible. And if we really want to be proud of who we are as a people, we have to face these things and we have to change them. Because otherwise, who are we if we know the truth and choose to do nothing?
Yes. So I'm actually really like speechless right now, because after hearing all this, it really makes me very intensely emotional. Um, so I just feel that, somehow as a humanity we are all connected here in Canada, and we didn't realize that this is what we were coming into when we came here. I came here 12 years ago. I didn't know. I was under the impression that Canada is such a fair country, and that's why we moved here. And so the things that I came across and the opportunities that I had to interact with Indigenous communities at Fort McMurray when I lived there, and in all the work that I've done, it has melted my heart, because I feel there is so much connection in my being Indian and the Indigenous communities. There's just so much connection, and many of the things like the elements, the very common. I mean, there's so much common history in Indigenous communities, and it's not just the Indian Indigenous and the Canadian. It's also when you talk to African people, their Indigenous communities have so much commonality, and I really believe that that's what brings us together. And instead of talking about dividing and putting these people aside, we should bring us all together. And it's in our common humanity that we will see a lot of different ways of how we can support each other and how we can live together as true brothers to each other. And so I truly believe that there is a future for all of us in this wonderful country that has invited us all in, despite the history. And so we need to actually work to make that future for the 7 generations happen. I've heard lots of Indigenous people talking that the 7 generations are over, and then the next seven is going to be, flowing with milk and honey. And I'm just praying that that actually happens. And I'm alive to see some of that positive change to Aboriginal communities in Canada. Is there any famous last words that either of you would like to say?
Can I add a piece there, just Mary, something you were
Sure.
saying about commonalities, like even the smudging and the burning of the sage, and then in Indian culture we light incense every day, and we bring incense through the place. And I think, and I originally studied anthropology and religious studies. I think one of the reasons why we find such common connection is because our cultures are both very ancient. And it's interesting with ancient cultures around the world, even though we were geographically separated, there is a lot of common connection. And there's something that's happened in the modern era. I'm not throwing out things from the modern era, but there's a blinding that happened. There was a disconnection, something was lost, and now strangely it's coming back. It's coming back through science and things like that. So I do feel like that we do have a common connection. But I do want to say that one of my pet peeves in around trying to challenge racism, pet peeve might not be the right word, but I get really frustrated with the idea of wanting to challenge us, and how do we do it, and how do we create space for people? And I hear things like mentoring, skill building, training, and things like this. And it comes from an assumption that we're all saturated in it, but it comes from an assumption that we're functioning in the system because we have more skills, or we have some superiority in some way, which is part of that misinformation handed down from colonization. And actually what needs to happen is we actually need to get out of the way. We need a real shift in leadership and diversity and equity and culture. And it doesn't happen from the one perspective, trying to create space for other people to come in and learn how to function in that perspective. Sometimes the best thing to do is to get out of the way. And honestly, I think if we kept listening to Indigenous leaders, Indigenous knowledge keepers, Indigenous people in general about what they're saying, listen, be quiet, get out of the way, support it, encourage it to happen, we will see the kind of changes. We will all benefit. This is another big fear that people have with great change. They're afraid they're going to lose something. They didn't notice how much they lost already. We've lost so much. We're in such a bad state. And I love the idea. This comes from, again, my children were born in Ireland and really identify as Irish as much as they do Indian and Canadian. And my older son comes here and it's Canada Day. And he's saying, it's the weirdest thing, Mom, because I can't tell that Canada ever gained an independence. And I say to him, tell me more. I love what you're saying. And he said, most people when they're colonized, and then there's some fight or rebellion. In Ireland, it took 900 years, but we now have an independence. But what is the independence here, where the settler colonizers formed their own government away from the original colonizers, but the original people who were colonized are still oppressed? So it's not an independence. And he refuses to see that. He's very vocal about this. And I love, and it's true. When we think about it, what independence are we talking about? A British satellite? Where Queen is still head of state. And I'm not asking to remove the Queen, because from Ireland, we're not that big on the Queen, but Canadians need to understand that the treaties are with the Queen.
That piece is really hard for me too, because I'm from India and I know that the Queen colonized us. So.
Yes, we have so much in common. But the treaties are with the Queen. They're with the Crown. And it's really misinformed to think that we need to remove the Queen and that will shift Canada's independence. So I just want to share my son's point of view, and I think he's right. What independence has there been in Canada? And I want to share one other point of view that I know in schools, we learned that there are two government systems in Canada, and actually there's three, right? So there's the federal, there's the provincial and local, but there's also the Indigenous government system that has been there from the forming of the treaties, and we don't learn about it. And because of that, I think, and Erin, I know we're coming to an end, but I'd love to hear what you think about this, because you're in government in this system, and then there's the other government system. But I think there's a reason why, because there's separate government systems, that not all Indigenous people are interested in the municipal process or these electoral processes, and they've been so disenfranchised from them. But I think there's another really interesting, clever kind of liberation idea that came from Ireland, which is that if we get our people elected into their government system, then we can shift their government system. And I think that is a really interesting idea. I think it would be a powerful thing for Canadians to go out and support Indigenous candidates everywhere they find them, to have more Indigenous people in government here. So I just wanted to say that, Erin. I would love to hear what you have to do.
I don't belong to the same board as Aaron Pickett, but if he was, he would surely have my vote. So it's really, really true what you said. And I truly believe that about every race that's here in Edmonton that makes Edmonton home. And most importantly, actually, our Indigenous leaders are so important, because their way is so much more genuine and connecting. It's not divisive. It's about everybody. The initial story about Turtle Island itself, it's not just about one race or another race. It's about all of us. And so, I believe that is how we Indians were too. That's why, our lands were open to everybody, and every kind of person came and colonized us and oppressed us, right? Just because we were so open. And so that's what happens when we receive with open hearts. Many people take advantage of that. So, at this point, it's time for us to take a step back and embrace that, instead of, saying that that's not our reality. We came later. We have nothing to do with that. We really, now that we are here and we have become a piece of this fabric, we have a role to play to make that fabric more beautiful than it is.
Mary, let me bring this. Sorry, and Erin, this is absolutely your space. But imagine, Mary, if you got on the plane, went back home to visit India, and all the people in government in India after colonization were the descendants of the British who were still in India.
That would be horrible. That would be horrible.
How would you feel? Would you feel there had been an independence of it?
No.
I'm just saying, I don't mean to stir it up, but I just feel.
No, I agree. I truly agree, because, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In my work too, I have brought this point up, but it's a very valid point. Not just a young child speaking, it's a very, very valid point. Because in every other colonized community, the colonizers left and people had their own system in place, but in Canada and maybe the US. So, Aaron, I would really like to hear from you about this.
Okay, well, I'll try. There's a couple things that stand out to me right away. And the first is that a lot of folks get really worried when they hear talk about Indigenous issues. A lot of folks who aren't Indigenous, because there's this, I don't know why, but this automatic feeling that if Indigenous people are helped in any way, that means that they themselves are being ignored or losing something.
Wow.
This idea of scarcity of resources that is really driven home into people. But the fact is that when we raise each other up, we all like the rising tide raises all boats. I mean, that's the way that we really need to look at it. No one is getting more than the other. And, I wonder if it's really mostly an Alberta and Western Canadian sort of mentality. I don't know. But a lot of people I know were worried when I was elected. They thought, oh, this guy's only going to focus on Indigenous issues and he's going to leave the rest of us high and dry. But what they failed to understand is that coming from an Indigenous perspective.
And guess what I was thinking, Aaron? I was thinking that why is Aaron not involved in Indigenous issues?
Because, well, the way it works to me is that embedded in myself through my culture is that everyone is deserving of love and attention, right? And so there's no way that I could ever just focus on Indigenous issues while serving the public. I have to serve everyone. And when it comes to Indigenous issues, I made a choice early on not to be the face of it. I wanted to elevate my colleagues into positions of being those champions and allowing other people to experience those successes and become allies in their own right. Rather than me trying to pull everyone along, allow them through my encouragement and sharing of knowledge, allow them to also become leaders. And that's a little bit of a slower process, I think. I think it's a little bit harder, but I think that it's very important that allies become leaders in change, not just an Indigenous person trying to tug everyone along. I don't think that is going to lead to success, because for one thing, it's this idea that in reconciliation, and I think Shalini said this earlier, I'm not the one who needs to do the reconciliation work, frankly, but I am the one who needs to encourage it and allow other people to step up and start doing that work. And I think that's what we need to be focusing on, is that
makes a lot of sense.
Has capacity. We have to encourage it. And there's a lot of emotional labor that Indigenous people do to move this work forward. And frankly, it gets exhausting because you have to be an expert in everything. You have to have basically a PhD in not only Indigenous issues, but Canadian issues and world history and so on and so forth, just for people to take you seriously. And so that can get very difficult. I mean, it's the same story with immigrants as it is with Indigenous people, that I had to develop an entire other career of success before I could even think about entering politics, because just to be considered on par, I had to have excelled beyond the norm. And so that's also a little bit of a challenge. Now, last but not least, I think that this idea of Indigenous governance is really fascinating. It's one that's been talked about for a long time. The problem is with the introduction of the Indian Act, Indigenous governmental systems were broken apart, and Indigenous communities were forced to take on the Western version of governance. And that has been actually fractious for our communities right from the start. It is not the traditional way of governance. And so ironically, the thing that we think works really, really well, like a United States of America with a Congress and a Senate and judges and a constitution and a Declaration of Independence, that all actually comes from the Iroquois Confederacy. That they literally looked at that template and said, let's do that for our government. And that's actually the basis of U.S. government is from
That's
the air across the
amazing. I
Canada.
never knew that.
Yeah, it's an open secret, and so a lot of the things that we love and celebrate about Canada actually happen to come from Indigenous values that have seeped into Western culture, which is why when we look at Canada, we see on the outside this vision of a country that is so welcoming and giving and open to all, because that was the attitude of the original inhabitants here. And if not for Indigenous people, the first Europeans would have starved. They would have died. They couldn't have survived. And for hundreds of years, what people don't know is that Indigenous people were the wealthiest people here in this great experimental collaboration. They were the ones that, if you married into that family, your status elevated if you were European. And it wasn't until a series of horrific betrayals that those tables not just turned, but those who welcomed and provided wealth were stolen from and relegated to the corner basement in a luxurious mansion. So there's much to do. I think we can do it. And I think that as long as we keep telling these stories, a lot of people will start understanding that the narrative that they grew up with maybe wasn't true. And at first that's uncomfortable. But over time, I think that a lot of people feel a lot better knowing the truth and feel more positive about the future of our country and the things that we can do. Because if we can accept one truth, then we can accept another and another and another. And all of the things that maybe plague our society across the board that have to do with denial of truth, maybe we can start putting that to rest. And maybe that can start by dealing with Indigenous issues and understanding that every single one of our children deserves a phenomenal and hopeful and profoundly wonderful future.
Thank you so much. And I hope that what you just said seeps into our education system so that, more of our children can actually hear the truth and not edited truth. And I really look forward to the change in curriculum where you actually hear everything that you just said. So thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for your perspectives. It's really valuable, not only to me, but the audience that is hearing us. So thank you for bringing your pieces to the table and for helping the community to actually, get through this big question of how do I support, how do I be an ally? Thank you so much for your perspectives, and till we meet again, goodbye.
Oh, thank you. Hi. And thank you for giving us a forum to indulge our nerdiness.
Thank you.
Hope to see you back on October 18th, Aaron.
We'll see. I hope so.
Bye.